Madison Crawford stepped out of her luxury hotel in London, adjusting her designer sunglasses and checking her reflection in the glass doors. At 23, she was the daughter of a tech billionaire from Silicon Valley, and she made sure everyone knew it. Her Instagram followers numbered in the millions, and she lived her life as if every moment needed to be documented and shared with the world. This was her first trip to Europe, a graduation gift from her father, after she barely managed to complete her communications degree. Madison had spent the previous week shopping on the Champs-Élysées in Paris, complaining loudly about how everything was so old and boring compared to California. Now in London, she was determined to get the perfect content for her social media channels. "Driver, take me to that place with the funny hat guards," she commanded, sliding into the back of her hired Bentley. The driver, a patient man named Jeffrey who had been driving tourists for 15 years, simply nodded and headed toward Buckingham Palace. Madison spent the ride taking selfies and posting stories about how quaint London was, completely missing the centuries of history passing by her window. She had already decided that the royal guards would make perfect props for her photos. After all, they just stood there like statues. They were practically made for Instagram. When they arrived at the palace, Madison immediately began planning her shots. She pulled out her professional camera equipment, which her father's assistant had purchased for her. Though she barely knew how to use it, the guards stood motionless in their iconic red uniforms and tall black hats, their faces stern and professional. "This is going to be so cool," Madison muttered to herself, approaching the nearest guard. She had read online that these guards weren't supposed to move or speak, which made them perfect for her purposes. What she hadn't bothered to research was the deep tradition, honor, and rigorous training behind their role. The guard she approached was Sergeant James Mitchell, a decorated soldier with 8 years of service. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and had earned his position through exceptional dedication and skill. Standing guard at the royal residences wasn't just a job. It was one of the highest honors in the British military. Madison positioned herself next to Sergeant Mitchell and began taking photos. At first, she simply posed beside him, but quickly grew bored with basic shots. She wanted something that would go viral, something that would get her the attention she craved. "Hey, can you smile?" she asked the guard who remained perfectly still. Madison frowned, not understanding that speaking to or attempting to interact with the guards was considered highly inappropriate by both tourists and locals alike. Other tourists nearby began to take notice as Madison became more persistent. "Come on, just one little smile," she coaxed, stepping closer to the guard. When he continued to remain motionless, she decided to get creative. Madison began making faces at the guard, trying to get a reaction. She pulled silly expressions, made loud noises, and even waved her hands in front of his face. Other visitors watched in growing discomfort, recognizing that her behavior was crossing lines of respect and decorum. "This is so stupid," Madison announced loudly when the guard refused to acknowledge her antics. "In America, people in costumes are way more fun. These guys are like robots or something." Her voice carried across the courtyard and several British tourists exchanged disapproving glances. One elderly gentleman approached her politely. "Miss, perhaps you might consider that these are working soldiers, not entertainers," he suggested gently. Madison turned to him with an eye roll. "Whatever, Grandpa. I paid good money to come here and I should be able to get decent photos. This guy is being totally unhelpful." The elderly man stepped back, shocked by her rudeness. Word of the disrespectful American tourist began to spread among the crowd. But Madison was oblivious to the growing tension around her. She decided to escalate her efforts, moving even closer to Sergeant Mitchell. She began poking at his uniform, trying to adjust his hat for a better photo angle. The guard's jaw tightened slightly, the only sign that he was fighting every instinct to maintain his professional composure. "Your hat is crooked," Madison declared, reaching up toward his bearskin cap. "Let me fix it for the photo." Several people in the crowd gasped audibly. Touching a royal guard's uniform was strictly forbidden, and everyone except Madison seemed to understand the gravity of what she was doing. Security personnel in the area began moving closer, though they hoped the situation would resolve itself without incident. Madison's behavior grew increasingly erratic as her frustration mounted. She had expected this to be easy content creation, but instead, she was being ignored by what she saw as a mere tourist attraction. Her entitled worldview couldn't comprehend that she was dealing with a highly trained professional who was performing his duty with dignity and honor. "Fine. If you won't cooperate, I'll just have to make this more interesting," she announced, pulling out her phone to start recording a video. She planned to create content mocking the guard's inability to react, not realizing that his restraint was actually a demonstration of exceptional discipline and training. The crowd around them had grown larger, with people stopping to watch the unfolding scene. Some were recording on their own phones, but not for the reasons Madison imagined. They were documenting what many considered to be shameful behavior that represented the worst stereotypes of American tourists abroad. Local news crews, always stationed near major tourist attractions, began to take notice of the commotion. A reporter from the BBC approached the scene, recognizing that this might develop into a story worth covering. As Madison continued her disrespectful display, she remained completely unaware that her actions were about to set in motion a series of events that would change not only her trip to London, but potentially her entire understanding of respect, tradition, and the consequences of entitled behavior. The patient professionalism of Sergeant Mitchell was about to be tested in ways his military training had prepared him for, though perhaps not in the context he had expected. Madison's behavior escalated as she began recording herself making jokes about the statue man who wouldn't respond to her. She started a live stream on Instagram, her voice carrying across the courtyard as she narrated her hilarious encounter with what she called Britain's most boring security guard. "Hey everyone, Madison here in London, and I'm trying to get this guy to crack a smile," she announced to her phone camera, pointing it at Sergeant Mitchell. "I think he might actually be a robot. Like seriously, who stands this still? It's so weird." The crowd around them had grown significantly, with tourists and locals alike stopping to witness the spectacle. Many were visibly uncomfortable with Madison's behavior, whispering among themselves about the American girl's lack of respect. Several British tourists looked genuinely offended, recognizing the honor and tradition that the guard represented. Margaret Henderson, a retired teacher from Yorkshire, couldn't contain herself any longer. She approached Madison with the kind of stern expression that had once commanded respect from countless students. "Young lady, you're being incredibly disrespectful. This man is a soldier serving his country with honor." Madison barely glanced at the older woman. "Look, lady, I don't know how things work here, but where I come from, customer service actually means something. I'm trying to get content for my followers, and this guy is literally doing nothing to help." "Customer service?" Margaret's voice rose in disbelief. "This is Buckingham Palace, not a theme park. That man is a member of the Queen's Guard, not an employee hired for your entertainment." But Madison had already dismissed Margaret, turning back to her phone to continue her stream. The number of viewers was climbing rapidly, though not for the reasons she imagined. Comments began flooding in, and while some of her usual followers were laughing along, many others were expressing shock and disapproval at her behavior. Dr. William Hayes, a military historian who happened to be visiting the palace that day, watched the scene unfold with growing concern. He understood better than most the significance of what he was witnessing. The guards represented centuries of British military tradition, and their role demanded the highest level of respect from both the public and visiting dignitaries. "This is quite serious," he murmured to his wife. "Sarah, that young woman has no idea what she's doing. These guards have been specifically chosen for their exceptional service records. They're not ceremonial figures, they're active military personnel." Sarah nodded, equally troubled. "Should we try to explain it to her?" "I fear she's past the point of listening to reason," William replied, noticing how Madison had begun to mock the guard's posture and facial expression in her video. "This could become an international incident if she continues." Meanwhile, the BBC reporter James Morrison had positioned himself strategically to capture the unfolding drama. He recognized the potential significance of the story, not just as entertainment, but as a broader commentary on cultural respect and the behavior of tourists at significant historical sites. Madison, emboldened by what she perceived as attention and engagement from her growing audience, decided to push her boundaries even further. She moved closer to Sergeant Mitchell, nearly pressing against him as she continued her commentary. "I bet if I tickle him, he'll have to react," she announced to her phone, reaching toward the guard's side. Several people in the crowd shouted "no" simultaneously, but Madison was too focused on her performance to heed their warnings. This was the moment when Sergeant Mitchell's training truly came into focus. He had been taught to handle various scenarios, from genuine threats to inappropriate tourist behavior, but always with the understanding that his response must be measured, professional, and appropriate to the situation. As Madison's hand approached his uniform, Sergeant Mitchell spoke for the first time, his voice clear and authoritative. "Step back, miss. You are not permitted to touch a member of the Queen's Guard." The crowd fell silent. Madison froze, her hand still extended, clearly shocked that the statue had suddenly spoken. For a moment she seemed genuinely surprised that he was in fact a real person capable of communication. "Oh my God, he talks," she exclaimed into her phone as if she had made some groundbreaking discovery. "This is going to get so many views." But the gravity of the situation was becoming clear to everyone except Madison. Security personnel who had been monitoring the situation from a distance began moving closer. Palace officials were being notified, and the incident was escalating beyond a simple tourist mishap. Sergeant Mitchell maintained his position, but continued to address Madison with professional authority. "I must ask you to maintain appropriate distance and cease your current behavior. This is an official request." Instead of complying, Madison seemed to view this as validation that her content was working. "You guys, he's actually talking to me now. This is amazing. I'm like the first person to get him to break character." She continued recording, completely misunderstanding the situation. In her mind, she had achieved some kind of breakthrough, not realizing that the guard's response was actually a warning that she was approaching serious trouble. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some tourists seemed entertained by the drama, taking photos and videos of their own. Others, particularly the British visitors, appeared increasingly appalled by Madison's behavior and her complete inability to understand the seriousness of the situation. A group of American tourists nearby began to distance themselves from Madison, clearly embarrassed by association. One of them, a middle-aged businessman from Texas, shook his head and muttered to his wife, "That girl's giving us all a bad name. Someone needs to set her straight before this gets worse." Palace security was now taking a more active role, with 2 officers approaching the scene. They had been monitoring the situation and were prepared to intervene if necessary. Their presence marked a turning point. What had started as inappropriate tourist behavior was now officially becoming a security concern. Madison remained oblivious to the escalating severity of her situation. In her social media-focused worldview, any attention was good attention, and the growing crowd and official response only confirmed in her mind that she was creating viral content. She had no understanding that she was actually creating a diplomatic embarrassment and potentially facing serious consequences for her actions. Stage was set for a confrontation that would expose not only Madison's ignorance and entitlement, but also demonstrate the professionalism and restraint of the British military and security services. The 2 palace security officers approached with measured steps, their presence immediately noticeable to everyone except Madison, who remained focused on her phone screen and the growing number of viewers on her live stream. The comment section was exploding with reactions from around the world, though Madison was only reading the ones that fed her ego. "Miss, I need you to step away from the guard immediately," said Officer Collins, the senior security officer. His tone was professional but firm, carrying the weight of authority that comes with protecting one of the world's most important royal residences. Madison looked up from her phone with an expression of annoyance rather than concern. "Excuse me? I'm just taking some photos. This is a public place, right? I have rights." Officer Collins exchanged a glance with his partner, Officer Davies. They had dealt with difficult tourists before, but Madison's combination of ignorance and entitlement was particularly challenging. "This is indeed a public space, miss, but there are protocols and rules of conduct that must be followed. Harassing members of the Queen's Guard is not permitted." "Harassing?" Madison's voice rose defensively. "I wasn't harassing anyone. I was trying to get some decent content, and your weird robot guard here finally started talking. If anything, I'm helping his career by making him famous." The crowd around them had grown even larger, with people recording the interaction on their phones. The BBC reporter James Morrison was now actively filming, recognizing that this had become a significant news story. He could already envision the headlines. "American tourists' disrespectful behavior at Palace sparks international incident." Dr. William Hayes, the military historian, approached Officer Collins respectfully. Officer, if I may, I believe this young woman genuinely doesn't understand the cultural and military significance of what she's doing. Perhaps some education rather than punishment might be appropriate. Madison overheard this and turned toward Dr. Hayes with an incredulous expression. Education? Are you kidding me? I went to Stanford. I probably know more about history than any of you people. This statement drew audible gasps from several British tourists, and Margaret Henderson, the retired teacher, couldn't contain her shock. Stanford clearly failed to teach you anything about respect or cultural sensitivity, dear. Officer Collins raised his hand to restore order to the increasingly chaotic situation. Miss, regardless of your educational background, you need to understand that you are currently disrupting an official military posting. Sergeant Mitchell is not a tourist attraction. He is a serving soldier performing his duty. Whatever, Madison replied, turning back to her phone. This is getting boring anyway. The guy barely even moved when I got close to him. American guards would have been way more fun. This comment proved to be the final straw for many in the crowd. Several British veterans who happened to be visiting the palace that day stepped forward, their faces showing a mixture of anger and disappointment. One of them, a former Royal Marine named Thomas Wright, addressed Madison directly. Young lady, that guy you're dismissing has likely seen more combat and shown more courage than you could imagine. The discipline he's showing right now, not reacting to your disrespectful behavior, is a testament to his professionalism and training. Madison looked at Thomas with the kind of blank expression that suggested his words weren't registering at all. Look, old man, I don't know what your deal is, but I'm just trying to have some fun. Why is everyone being so serious about everything? At this point, Sergeant Mitchell himself requested permission to speak, which was granted by Officer Collins. The crowd fell silent as the guard addressed Madison directly. Miss, I want you to understand something. This uniform represents service to the crown and country. Every thread, every button, every aspect of what you see before you has been earned through dedication, sacrifice, and honor. When you mock or disrespect this uniform, you're not just disrespecting me. You're disrespecting every service member who has worn it, including those who have given their lives in service. The power and dignity of his words created a profound silence in the courtyard. Even Madison seemed momentarily taken aback by the gravity of his statement. For just a moment it appeared that she might actually be beginning to understand the magnitude of her behavior, but the moment passed quickly. Okay, well, that's nice and all, Madison replied, already looking back at her phone. But I still don't see why everyone's making such a big deal out of this. It's not like I was hurting anyone. This response sent ripples of disbelief through the crowd. The American tourists present looked genuinely embarrassed, with several approaching Officer Collins to apologize on behalf of their countrywoman. A delegation of schoolchildren who had been visiting the palace, with their teacher, watched in wide-eyed amazement at the adult behaving worse than any of them would. Dare's Officer Davies stepped forward with a more serious tone. Miss, I'm going to need to see your identification and ask you to come with us for a formal discussion about appropriate conduct at royal residences. What? No way. Madison's voice took on a panicked edge for the first time. I'm not going anywhere with you guys. I haven't done anything wrong. This is harassment. I want to call the American Embassy. The mention of the embassy caught the attention of James Morrison, the BBC reporter, who realized that this incident was potentially escalating into a diplomatic matter. He began making calls to his newsroom, alerting them that they might have a significant international story developing. Dr. Hayes attempted one more time to mediate the situation. Miss Crawford, I heard someone mention your name. Perhaps if you simply apologize to the sergeant and acknowledge that you've learned something today, this could all be resolved peacefully. Madison stared at him as if he had suggested she jump off a cliff. Apologize for what? For trying to take some photos? For trying to have a good time? This is insane. I'm posting about this whole crazy experience when I get back to my hotel. Her threat to publicize the incident further alarmed the security officers, who realized that Madison's social media presence could turn this into an international embarrassment for both countries. They began coordinating with their supervisors via radio, discussing the best way to handle a situation that was rapidly spinning out of control. Meanwhile, Madison's live stream continued, with viewers from around the world watching the drama unfold in real time. Comments poured in from people expressing everything from support for Madison to outrage at her behavior. The incident was beginning to trend on social media platforms, though not in the way Madison had intended. The crowd continued to grow as word spread throughout the palace grounds about the American tourist causing a scene. Palace officials were being briefed, and discussions were taking place about how to handle what was becoming a significant public relations challenge. As the situation continued to escalate, a new figure appeared on the scene that would change everything. Colonel Sir Edward Blackwood, the commanding officer responsible for the Palace Guard detachment, had been alerted to the incident and arrived to assess the situation personally. His presence was immediately felt, tall, distinguished. With decades of military service evident in his bearing, he commanded instant respect from everyone present. The crowd parted respectfully as Colonel Blackwood approached. Madison, still focused on her phone and her streaming audience, initially didn't notice the change in atmosphere around her. When she finally looked up, she saw what appeared to be another costume guard approaching. Though this one had more elaborate decorations on his uniform. "Oh, great. Here comes the head costume guy," she announced to her phone camera, completely missing the significance of the moment. "Maybe this one will actually be interesting." Colonel Blackwood stopped directly in front of Madison, his expression serious but controlled. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Miss, I am Colonel Sir Edward Blackwood, commanding officer of this detachment. I understand there has been an incident involving disrespectful behavior toward one of my soldiers." For the first time since the entire episode began, Madison seemed to sense that she might actually be in serious trouble. Something about the colonel's presence and tone penetrated even her self-absorbed focus. "Look, I don't know what everyone's problem is. I was just taking some photos and having fun. Nobody told me there were all these crazy rules." "Ignorance of protocol is not an excuse for disrespectful behavior," Colonel Blackwood replied calmly. "These men and women represent the finest traditions of British military service. They have earned their positions through exceptional dedication and sacrifice. Your behavior today has been observed by hundreds of people and broadcast internationally. Through your own social media channels." Madison's eyes widened as she began to realize that her fun content creation might have consequences she hadn't considered. "International? What do you mean, international?" James Morrison, the BBC reporter, stepped forward respectfully. "Colonel James Morrison, BBC News. This incident has been live-streamed to thousands of viewers worldwide and is already trending on several social media platforms. We've received inquiries from news outlets in the United States asking for comment." The reality of the situation began to dawn on Madison. Her face grew pale as she understood that her behavior wasn't just being seen by her usual Instagram followers, but by people around the world. "Wait, this is on the news? Real news?" Colonel Blackwood nodded gravely. "Indeed, your actions today reflect not only on yourself, but potentially on relations between our countries. The disrespect you have shown to Sergeant Mitchell and the institution he represents has been witnessed by citizens of both the United Kingdom and the United States." Dr. Hayes, who had been watching the exchange with great interest, approached the colonel. "Sir, if I may suggest, perhaps this could be turned into a learning opportunity rather than simply a punishment. Miss Crawford clearly doesn't understand the historical and cultural significance of what she's encountering here." Madison looked between the colonel and Dr. Hayes with growing panic. "Learning opportunity? Punishment? I just want to go back to my hotel. Can't we just forget this whole thing happened?" "I'm afraid that's not possible," Colonel Blackwood replied. "Your livestream has been recorded and shared by numerous viewers. The damage to diplomatic relations and public perception has already occurred. However, Dr. Hayes raises an interesting point. Perhaps understanding what you have disrespected might help you appreciate the gravity of your actions." Margaret Henderson, the retired teacher who had tried to correct Madison earlier, stepped forward. "Colonel, if I may, I spent 40 years teaching young people about respect and cultural sensitivity. This young woman's behavior suggests a fundamental lack of understanding about the world beyond her own immediate experience." Madison bristled at being discussed as if she weren't present. "Hey, I'm standing right here. And for your information, I've traveled all over Europe. I'm not some ignorant American tourist. Your behavior today suggests otherwise," Colonel Blackwood observed dryly. "Tell me, Miss Crawford, what do you know about the history of the Queen's Guard?" They stand around in funny hats and don't move," Madison ventured, her voice uncertain for the first time. A collective sigh went up from the British citizens in the crowd. Thomas Wright, the former Royal Marine, shook his head in disbelief. Bloody hell, she really doesn't know anything, does she? Colonel Blackwood maintained his composure. Sergeant Mitchell, would you care to share with Miss Crawford some details about your service record? Sergeant Mitchell stepped forward slightly, maintaining his professional bearing. Colonel, I've served 8 years in the British Army, including 2 tours in Afghanistan. I've been awarded the Afghanistan Medal and the Operational Service Medal. I was selected for the Queen's Guard after demonstrating exceptional performance in both combat and ceremonial duties. Madison stared at him with something approaching shock. You were in a war? I was deployed in support of NATO operations in Afghanistan, yes, miss. As have many of the guards you see here. This isn't a costume. It's a uniform earned through service and sacrifice. The weight of this revelation seemed to hit Madison like a physical blow. For the first time, she appeared to genuinely understand that she had been treating a combat veteran like a tourist attraction. Her phone, which had been constantly in her hand throughout the incident, slowly lowered to her side. I didn't know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Of course you didn't, Colonel Blackwood said, though his tone had softened slightly. You made assumptions based on appearances without taking the time to understand what you were actually seeing. This is precisely the kind of cultural insensitivity that damages relationships between nations. The crowd around them had grown silent, watching as Madison appeared to experience her first genuine moment of self-reflection in the entire incident. Her usual confident demeanor had evaporated, replaced by something that looked like actual shame. The question now, Colonel Blackwood continued, is what you intend to do about it. Your actions have been broadcast around the world. How do you propose to address the disrespect you have shown? Madison looked around at the faces surrounding her, British citizens who had been offended by her behavior, American tourists who were embarrassed by association, military veterans who had watched her mock their service, and officials who were treating her actions as a serious international incident. For the first time since arriving in London, Madison was confronted with the reality that her actions had consequences beyond her own immediate gratification, and that the world did not, in fact, revolve around her social media presence. The silence stretched on as Madison grappled with the magnitude of what she had done. Around her, the crowd waited to see how she would respond to Colonel Blackwood's challenge. The live stream on her phone continued, though she had forgotten about it entirely, broadcasting her moment of reckoning to thousands of viewers worldwide. Madison started, then stopped, seemingly unable to find words. For someone who had built her entire identity around confident social media performances, this moment of genuine vulnerability was entirely foreign territory. Dr. Hayes stepped forward gently. Miss Crawford, perhaps you could start by understanding what you've been part of today. These guards represent over 350 years of British military tradition. The ceremony and protocols you've been mocking have been maintained through wars, social changes, and countless challenges to preserve something meaningful for future generations. Madison looked at Dr. Hayes, then at Sergeant Mitchell, then at the faces of the people around her. The reality of her situation was becoming clearer with each passing moment. I really messed up, didn't I? That's an understatement, muttered Thomas Wright, though his tone had lost some of its earlier anger. Colonel Blackwood studied Madison carefully. The question is whether you're capable of learning from this experience or if you'll simply return to your hotel and dismiss this as another inconvenience in your vacation. Sir, James Morrison interjected, I should mention that this incident is already being picked up by international news outlets. CNN and Fox News have both contacted the BBC for footage and comment. This is becoming a significant story about American tourist behavior abroad. Madison's face went completely white. CNN, Fox News? Oh my God, my father's going to kill me. His company's image. This could affect his business deals. For the first time, Madison seemed to understand that her actions could have consequences beyond her own social media presence. The realization that she might have embarrassed not just herself, but potentially damaged her father's international business relationships was clearly a new and terrifying concept. Margaret Henderson, the retired teacher, recognized the teachable moment that was developing. Young lady, sometimes the most important lessons come from our worst mistakes. The question is whether you're mature enough to learn from this one. Madison took a shaky breath. What? What am I supposed to do? How do I fix this? Colonel Blackwood exchanged glances with Dr. Hayes and the other officials present. That depends entirely on whether your remorse is genuine or simply fear of consequences. True understanding requires more than just regret over being caught. I think... Madison paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily to someone accustomed to superficial social media interactions. I think I need to understand what I don't understand. Does that make sense? Dr. Hayes nodded encouragingly. That's actually a very wise recognition. Would you be willing to learn about what you've encountered here today? Madison looked around the crowd, seeing the faces of people she had dismissed or ignored throughout the incident. The elderly British tourists who had tried to educate her, the American visitors who had been embarrassed by her behavior, the veterans who had watched her mock their service, all of them were looking at her with a mixture of skepticism and cautious hope. Yes, she said quietly. I think I need to learn a lot of things. Colonel Blackwood made a decision that surprised everyone present. Very well. Dr. Hayes, would you be willing to provide Miss Crawford with some education about British military traditions and the significance of the Queen's Guard? I would be honored, Colonel. And Miss Crawford, the Colonel continued, I want you to understand that this is not a publicity opportunity or content creation exercise. This is a chance for genuine learning and growth. Are you prepared to approach this with the seriousness it deserves? Madison nodded, though she still looked overwhelmed by the situation. I think so. I mean, yes. I want to try. Sergeant Mitchell, who had maintained his professional bearing throughout the entire incident, requested permission to speak. Colonel, if I may, I think it might be valuable for Miss Crawford to hear from some of the other guards about their experiences and why this service means so much to us. An excellent suggestion. Sergeant, James Morrison approached Colonel Blackwood respectfully. Sir, would you consider allowing the BBC to document this educational process? It could serve as a positive follow-up to the initial incident, showing how misunderstandings can be addressed through dialogue and education, rather than just punishment. Madison looked panicked at the suggestion. More cameras? I don't know if I can handle this becoming an even bigger story. That's precisely the point, Colonel Blackwood replied. You created this situation through your public behavior and social media broadcasting. Taking responsibility means being willing to publicly demonstrate that you've learned from your mistakes. Dr. Hayes offered a reassuring smile. Miss Crawford, sometimes the best way to repair damage is to show genuine growth and understanding. If people see that you're capable of learning and changing, it reflects well on both you and your country. Madison considered this, her usual quick social media responses replaced by genuine contemplation. Okay, she said finally. If it helps fix what I broke, then okay. The crowd began to disperse slightly as the immediate crisis seemed to be resolving into something more constructive. However, many people remained curious to see how this unusual situation would develop. The incident had transformed from a simple case of tourist misbehavior into something resembling an international cultural exchange program. Margaret Henderson approached Madison with a kind but serious expression. Dear, you're about to receive an education that most people would pay thousands of pounds for. Make sure you appreciate the opportunity you're being given. I will, Madison replied, and for the first time since arriving at the palace, she seemed to mean what she was saying. Officer Collins coordinated with palace officials to arrange for a proper educational session, while Officer Davies began managing the crowd to ensure the learning process could proceed without further disruption. The BBC crew prepared to document what they hoped would become a positive example of how cultural misunderstandings could be resolved. Through education and mutual respect, as preparations began for Madison's unexpected education in British military history and traditions, it became clear that what had started as an embarrassing international incident might actually become something much more valuable, a genuine cross-cultural learning experience that could benefit both the participants and the millions of people who would ultimately witness the story's resolution. 2 hours later, Madison sat in a private room within the palace complex, surrounded by people who had transformed from adversaries into teachers. Dr. Hayes had spent the time walking her through centuries of British military history, while Colonel Blackwood shared stories of modern service members who had earned the honor of serving in the Queen's Guard. The change in Madison was remarkable and visible. Gone was the entitled, dismissive attitude that had characterized her earlier behavior. In its place was something resembling genuine curiosity and growing understanding. She had learned that many of the guards were combat veterans, that their selection process was incredibly rigorous, and that their ceremonial duties were considered among the highest honors in the British military. "I had no idea," Madison said for perhaps the 10th time, shaking her head as Dr. Hayes explained the significance of the various medals and decorations worn by the guards. "In America, we don't really have anything quite like this. Our military ceremonies are different." "Different doesn't mean lesser," Colonel Blackwood observed. "Every nation honors its military traditions in its own way. The key is recognizing and respecting those traditions when you encounter them, even if they're unfamiliar to you." Sergeant Mitchell, who had been relieved from his post to participate in the educational session, sat across from Madison. The awkwardness between them was palpable, but both seemed committed to working through it. "Sergeant Mitchell," Madison said hesitantly, "I owe you a massive apology. I treated you like you were just a prop for my photos. I didn't see you as a real person with real experiences and real service to your country." "Apology accepted, miss," Sergeant Mitchell replied formally. "But I hope you understand that the apology isn't just owed to me. It's owed to everyone who serves and to the people who hold these traditions sacred." Madison nodded seriously. "I'm beginning to understand that." Dr. Hayes explained about the guards who have died in service and the families who consider this a sacred honor. "I feel sick thinking about how I acted." James Morrison, the BBC reporter, had been documenting the entire educational process with permission from all parties. What was emerging was a story far more complex and ultimately more positive than the initial incident had suggested. "Miss Crawford," Morrison said during a break in the education session, "your initial live stream has been viewed over 2 million times now, and the story has been picked up by news outlets across the globe. How do you feel about the attention this has received?" Madison was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Honestly, I'm embarrassed, not just because I got in trouble, but because I represented my country so poorly. Americans watching this must be mortified by my behavior, and British people probably think we're all like this." Dr. Hayes leaned forward. "The important thing is what you do next. You have an opportunity to show people that Americans are capable of learning, growing, and showing respect for other cultures. That's actually a very positive message." "But how do I do that?" Madison asked. "I mean, the damage is already done. People have already seen me acting like a complete idiot." Colonel Blackwood smiled slightly, the first time his stern expression had softened during the entire incident. "Miss Crawford, one of the most admirable qualities a person can demonstrate is the ability to acknowledge their mistakes and learn from them. Military personnel understand this better than most. We're constantly learning, adapting, and growing from our experiences." Margaret Henderson, who had been invited to join the educational session, added her perspective. "Dear, I've seen thousands of young people make mistakes over the years. The ones who grow into admirable adults are the ones who face their mistakes honestly and use them as opportunities to become better people." Madison looked around the room at the faces of people who had started as critics, but were now offering her guidance and support. "So what should I do? Should I make another video explaining what I learned?" "That's one possibility," Dr. Hayes suggested. "But perhaps more importantly, you should think about how this experience might change how you approach new situations in the future. Real learning isn't just about fixing one mistake. It's about developing better judgment and cultural sensitivity going forward." Thomas Wright, the former Royal Marine who had been particularly critical of Madison earlier, had also joined the session. "Miss, I'll be honest. When I first saw your behavior, I thought you were just another spoiled tourist who would never learn anything from the experience. But sitting here now, listening to you ask genuine questions and show real remorse, I have to admit I was wrong about your character." Madison's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion she had shown since the incident began. "Thank you for giving me a chance to prove that I'm not as terrible as I seemed this morning." "We all have the capacity for growth," Colonel Blackwood observed. "The question is whether we're willing to do the work required to change." As the educational session continued, Madison began to understand not just the specific traditions she had violated, but the broader principles of respect, service, and cultural sensitivity that she had been lacking. The guards shared stories of their training, their deployments, and what it meant to them to serve in such a visible role representing their country. "I want to do something," Madison announced suddenly. "I want to find a way to make this right, not just for myself but for everyone who was affected by my behavior." "What did you have in mind?" Dr. Hayes asked. "I don't know yet," Madison admitted. "But I want it to be meaningful, not just another social media post. I want to do something that actually honors what I've learned here today." Colonel Blackwood and Dr. Hayes exchanged glances, recognizing that Madison's transformation appeared to be genuine. The entitled tourist who had arrived that morning seemed to have been replaced by someone capable of reflection, learning, and genuine remorse. "We'll help you think of something appropriate," Colonel Blackwood said. "But first, I think there's someone else you should meet." He gestured toward the door where a new figure was entering the room. Madison looked up to see an older woman in elegant dress carrying herself with unmistakable dignity and authority. The room fell silent as everyone rose to their feet in respect. Madison realized she was about to meet someone who would provide the final piece of her education about the gravity of her actions and the opportunity for redemption that lay before her. The woman who entered was Lady Catherine Windsor Pemberton, a senior member of the royal household staff and patron of several military charities. Her presence commanded immediate respect from everyone in the room, and Madison instinctively understood that she was meeting someone of significant importance. "Lady Catherine," Colonel Blackwood said formally, "may I present Miss Madison Crawford, the American visitor we discussed." Lady Catherine studied Madison with intelligent, assessing eyes. "Miss Crawford, I understand you've had quite an educational day." "Yes, ma'am," Madison replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The casual confidence that had defined her personality seemed to have disappeared entirely, replaced by genuine humility. "I've been following your situation with interest," Lady Catherine continued, settling into a chair with practiced grace. "Colonel Blackwood tells me you've shown remarkable growth in your understanding of our traditions and the significance of military service." Madison nodded, unsure how to respond to someone whose very presence seemed to embody centuries of British tradition and protocol. "I've also been informed that you wish to make amends for your earlier behavior," Lady Catherine said. "That speaks well of your character, though I must say the initial incident was quite concerning from a diplomatic perspective." James Morrison, the BBC reporter, requested permission to continue filming. "Lady Catherine, the story has garnered international attention. Miss Crawford's transformation and whatever resolution emerges could have significant positive impact on cultural understanding." "Indeed," Lady Catherine agreed. "Which is why I've come to make a proposal." Madison looked up with surprise and cautious hope. "Miss Crawford, we have a program here that brings together young people from different countries to learn about military history, service traditions, and cultural exchange. It's quite rigorous and requires genuine commitment to learning and personal growth. Would you be interested in participating?" You would let me do that? After what I did?" Madison asked, incredulous. "The fact that you're surprised by the offer suggests you understand the gravity of your earlier actions," Lady Catherine observed. "But yes, we believe in the power of education and second chances. However, this would not be a casual tourist experience. You would be expected to demonstrate the same level of respect and dedication shown by the service members you encountered today." Dr. Hayes leaned forward excitedly. "Lady Catherine, this could be exactly the kind of meaningful response we were discussing. A genuine commitment to learning and service rather than just an apology. What would it involve?" Madison asked, her voice showing both nervousness and genuine interest. "You would spend a week working with military historians, active service members, and cultural experts," Lady Catherine explained. "You would learn not just about British traditions, but about the broader concepts of service, sacrifice, and respect that military personnel embody worldwide. You would also work with our public relations team to create educational content that could help other visitors understand and appreciate what they're seeing when they visit our historic sites," Colonel Blackwood added. "It would also involve a formal ceremony where you would publicly acknowledge your mistakes and demonstrate what you've learned. This wouldn't be for social media glory. It would be a genuine act of accountability and education." Madison was quiet for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what was being offered. Finally, she spoke. I want to do it. Not because it might fix my reputation or make good content, but because I think I need to understand things I never bothered to learn before. Thomas Wright, the former Royal Marine, smiled for the first time since the incident began. That's the right answer, miss. Growth requires work, not just good intentions. Margaret Henderson wiped away a tear. In 40 years of teaching, I've rarely seen such a complete transformation in understanding. You should be proud of your willingness to learn, dear. Sergeant Mitchell stepped forward. Miss Crawford, if you do participate in this program, I'd like to volunteer to be part of your education. I think it might be valuable for both of us. Madison looked at him with genuine gratitude. After how I treated you, you'd be willing to help me learn? That's what service means, Sergeant Mitchell replied simply, putting the greater good above personal feelings. Lady Catherine stood, signaling that the formal part of the meeting was concluding. Miss Crawford, if you're serious about this commitment, we'll begin tomorrow morning. I should warn you, this won't be easy and it won't be glamorous. It will require you to confront some uncomfortable truths about yourself and your worldview. I understand, Madison replied, and I'm ready. James Morrison concluded his documentation of the remarkable transformation. Lady Catherine, Colonel, this has been an extraordinary example of how cultural misunderstandings can be transformed into learning opportunities. Will this program be open to other international visitors? We're certainly considering it, Lady Catherine replied. If Miss Crawford's experience proves successful, it could become a model for cultural education programs worldwide. As the meeting concluded, Madison found herself surrounded by people who had started the day as strangers and critics, but had become teachers and supporters. The entitled tourist who had arrived that morning seemed like a different person entirely. Miss Crawford, Lady Catherine said as they prepared to leave, you should know that your father has been contacted by the embassy. He's flying to London tomorrow to support you through this process. Madison's face showed a mixture of embarrassment and relief. Is he angry? He's concerned, Lady Catherine replied diplomatically, but also proud that his daughter is taking responsibility for her actions and committed to learning from them. 6 months later, Madison returned to Buckingham Palace, but this time as a cultural education ambassador. The program she had participated in had been so successful that it had been expanded into a formal international exchange initiative. Her transformation from an ignorant, entitled tourist into a thoughtful advocate for cultural understanding had been documented and shared as an example of the power of education and personal growth. Standing beside Sergeant Mitchell, now a close friend and colleague, Madison addressed a group of new participants in the program. 6 months ago, I stood in this exact spot and made a fool of myself, my country, and everything I thought I stood for. But sometimes our worst moments can become the foundation for our best selves, if we're willing to do the work to change. The story that had begun with international embarrassment had become a testament to the possibility of redemption, education, and cross-cultural understanding. Madison's transformation had not only repaired the damage of her initial behavior, but had created something positive that would benefit countless others in the years to come.